In the year 1293, 1,000 ships descended from the port of Quanzhou, loaded with more than 20,000 soldiers from the most vast empire the world had ever known. They sailed for months across unknown seas, beneath a sun that stole their breath, with holds packed with provisions for a year and the absolute certainty that no island could resist them. They were the extension of Kublai Khan's fist, the man who had bent China to his will, who had ravaged kingdoms from Persia to Korea. And their destination was a green and distant island called Java. But Java was not what they seemed to believe. It was not a defenseless island. It was not a kingdom that would kneel at the sight of their banners. Deep within its jungles, between rivers that slithered like serpents of mud, a prince without a throne and without an army watched them arrive, not with fear, with calculation. And when the empire's troops pushed into that impenetrable vegetation, the land itself declared war upon them. Arrows whistled from invisible canopies, elephants charged from the mist, rivers swallowed entire columns. Soldiers who had conquered continents fell, one by one, in a green inferno from which there was no escape. When the surviving ships finally weighed anchor and fled northward, more than half of that fearsome force had vanished. An empire that ruled half the world had been devoured by a jungle, and the man who made it happen, the crownless prince who deceived the Mongols with a smile, would build upon those ashes one of the most powerful empires in all of Southeast Asia. This is the story of how Java swallowed the invincible. To understand what happened in the jungles of Java that year, one must step back and observe the world as it was in the final decades of the 13th century. The Mongol Empire, born on the frozen steppes under the vision of Genghis Khan, had become the largest political entity humanity had ever constructed. From the plains of Hungary to the coasts of Korea, from the snows of Siberia to the deserts of Mesopotamia, its shadow covered entire continents. And at the helm of its most powerful branch, the Yuan dynasty seated in China, reigned Kublai Khan, a man who had not only conquered the Chinese throne, but had absorbed the sophistication of its civilization, its naval technology, its millennial bureaucracy, and fused them with the military brutality of the steppe. Kublai Khan was not content to rule dry land. His ambition stretched beyond the coasts, toward the southern seas, toward the islands rich in spices and gold that merchants described with reverence. He had attempted to conquer Japan twice, in 1274 and 1281, and both times nature had defeated him. Typhoons that the Japanese would call kamikaze, divine wind. He had sent armies against Vietnam, against Burma, against Champa, and in every tropical campaign, his horsemen had encountered an enemy they could not defeat with arrows or lances, the jungle itself. But Kublai did not learn from his defeats, or perhaps he simply refused to accept them. And then came the insult. In 1289, Kublai sent an emissary to the island of Java, to the powerful kingdom of Singhasari, demanding tribute and submission. King Kertanegara, a proud ruler who had expanded his dominion across Sumatra and forged alliances with Champa precisely to resist the Mongols, did not merely reject the demand. He did something no monarch in Asia had dared to do. He seized the Mongol emissary, branded his face with a red-hot iron, as was done to common thieves, cut off his ears, and sent him back to China. The insult was seismic. In the Mongol worldview, an emissary was sacred. Refusing tribute was defiance. Mutilating the messenger was a declaration of war that demanded absolute punishment. Kublai Khan, enraged, ordered a punitive expedition that would leave no doubt about the price of insolence. But between the order and its execution, time passed, and in Java, fate outpaced the Mongols. In 1292, before the invasion fleet set sail, Jayakatwang, the vassal governor of Kadiri, a descendant of the ancient royal line dispossessed by Singasari decades earlier, launched a rebellion. His troops attacked the capital from two flanks. Kartanagara, the king who had defied the Mongols, was assassinated during a tantric religious ceremony while drinking palm wine. The kingdom of Singasari, which had been the dominant power of Java, fell in a single night. Among the survivors of that massacre was a young man, a prince, Kartanagara's son-in-law. His name was Raden Wijaya, and his story was about to become one of the greatest masterstrokes in military history. Raden Wijaya was no ordinary warrior. Trained from childhood in the art of combat, promoted to general by his own father-in-law, he was a man forged in both martial discipline and political cunning. When Singasari fell and Kartanagara was killed, Wijaya tried to defend the capital. He failed. With only 3 loyal companions, Rangalawe, Sora and Nambi, he fled eastward, pursued by Jayakatwang's forces, crossing the island in a desperate race for survival. He found refuge on the island of Madura, under the protection of Arya Wiraraja, a shrewd regent playing his own political game. Through Wiraraja's mediation, Wijaya achieved the unthinkable. He obtained Jayakatwang's pardon. The usurper, confident in his victory, granted him permission to establish a new settlement in the Tarik timberland, a jungle territory in the delta of the Brantus River. There, among trees bearing a bitter fruit called Maja, Wijaya founded a village that would carry the name of that bitterness, Majapahit. Maja, the fruit. Pahit, bitter. No one imagined that from that bitterness, an empire would be born. While Wijaya built in silence, waiting on the other side of the sea, the storm was brewing. In the shipyards of Quanzhou, the military machinery of the Yuan dynasty was set in motion. 1,000 ships, between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers recruited from the garrisons of Fujian, Jiangxi and Huguang. Mongol cavalry with their fearsome composite bows, Chinese infantry with pikes and battle axes, incendiary rockets, bronze cannons, iron grenades launched by catapults, naphtha throwers. It was a force designed to crush any resistance. In command were 3 generals: Shibi, a Mongol commander of proven ferocity; Ike Mese, a Uyghur navigator who knew the southern maritime routes; and Gao Xing, a Chinese officer in charge of logistics and ground troops. They carried provisions for a year and a direct order from the Great Khan: subdue Java and punish the king who had dared to mutilate an imperial emissary. What they did not know was that the king they sought was already dead. The fleet departed in late 1292. The voyage was long and exhausting. More than 4,000 kilometers of open sea, skirting the coasts of Vietnam and Champa, stopping at the Karimata Islands to plan their strategy. The small states of Malaya and Sumatra submitted along the way and sent envoys of submission. The UN commanders left governors at every port. Everything seemed to be proceeding as planned. On the 22nd of January, 1293, Ike Mese sent an advance party to announce the imperial order in Java. The main fleet sailed to Karimunjawa and from there to Tuban, on the northern coast of eastern Java. Upon arrival, they pillaged the coastal town and the surrounding villages. The invasion had begun. But Java was not an open steppe where Mongol cavalry could gallop in formation. It was not a battlefield where arrows could darken the sky without obstruction. Java was something entirely different. It was an island of volcanoes and jungles, of rivers that forked into labyrinths of mud, of vegetation so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground. The air was thick, humid, hot as the inside of a furnace. Mosquitoes formed clouds that clung to the skin. Snakes slithered between the roots. The earth itself seemed to breathe, hostile, alive, waiting. The Mongol commanders split their forces into 2 columns. The first, under Gao Xing and Ike Mese, would advance overland with cavalry and infantry. The second, under Shibi, would follow by river in boats, sailing toward the estuary of Sedayu and then up the Kalimas, a tributary of the Brantus River. The plan was to converge and march inland together. It was then that the messenger appeared. An envoy from Raden Wijaya arrived from Madura with news that would change the entire course of the campaign. He informed the Yuan generals that Kertanagara, the king they had come to punish, had been assassinated, that a usurper named Jayakatwang now ruled Java, and that Raden Wijaya, the legitimate heir, offered his loyalty to the great Khan in exchange for help in overthrowing the traitor. It was an irresistible offer. The Mongols had a local guide who knew every path, every river, every fortress, an ally who promised tribute and submission, a prince who knelt before them and offered them exactly what they had come for. Shibi accepted. What he could not have imagined was that he was accepting his own destruction. The alliance worked with lethal precision. Wijaya guided the Yuan troops upriver along the Brantus, providing detailed intelligence on Kadiri's defenses, its roads, its rivers, its resources. The Mongols advanced with the confidence of those who have already won. Some Kadiri troops tried to stop them at the river crossings, but they were swept aside with ease. On the 26th of April, 1293, the combined forces reached Daha, the capital of Kadiri. The army split into 3 columns of attack. One sailed along the river, another marched along the eastern bank under Ikamese. The third advanced along the western bank under Gaoxing. Wijaya's troops marched behind them, observing, calculating. The battle for Daha was fierce. From 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, Kadiri's forces held. 3 consecutive assaults hammered the defenses, but against the Mongol military machine, the resistance shattered. 5,000 Kadiri soldiers fell. Thousands more tried to cross the river and drowned. While the Mongols stormed from the front, Wijaya's forces attacked from another direction, entered the palace, and freed the captive princesses, daughters of Kertanagara. Jayakatwang was captured in his own palace. The city fell, the usurper surrendered. The Mongols had completed their mission, or so they believed. Now came the most decisive moment, the moment no Mongol general could have foreseen. Raden Wijaya, with a calm that bordered on the superhuman, presented himself before the Yuan commanders and told them he needed to return to his territory in Majapahit to prepare the promised tribute. That he would return with gold, spices, textiles, everything the great Khan could desire. The generals agreed. After weeks of campaigning in that infernal heat, with their troops exhausted, sick, decimated by tropical fevers and the relentless climate, the promise of a peaceful tribute sounded like music. They sent 200 unarmed soldiers with 2 officers to accompany Wijaya and supervise the preparation of the tribute. It was the last decision they would make as victors. Wijaya disappeared into the jungle with his escort, and in the depths of that impenetrable green, the crownless prince revealed his true face. He mobilized his warriors, the men who had marched silently behind the Mongols for weeks, those who had smiled while sharpening their kris daggers in the darkness, those who had studied every weakness, every guard pattern, every supply route of the invading army. The 200 unarmed soldiers were ambushed first. They fell without being able to defend themselves, slaughtered on the narrow paths that the jungle closed like jaws. And then Wijaya marched on the main camp. What followed was calculated carnage. Javanese warriors emerged from the jungle like shadows. They attacked at night, when the tropical darkness was absolute, when the Mongols slept, the exhausted sleep of men who had spent months fighting under a sun they did not know. Arrows surged from between the trees. The kris, those sacred wavy-bladed daggers, gleamed under the moon. War elephants, enormous and terrifying beasts, charged into the Mongol lines, scattering the steppe horses that had never seen such a creature. Mongol cavalry, the invincible weapon that had conquered half the world, was useless. There was no room to gallop. There was no plain on which to form up. The trees were walls, the roots were traps, the rivers were barriers. Every path became an ambush, every clearing was a killing ground. The archers, masters of the open steppe, could not shoot at what they could not see. Their arrows vanished into the foliage, their formations dissolved in the mud, their leather and steel armor, designed for the cold of the central plains, became furnaces in the tropical heat. Sweat blinded them. Humidity rotted everything. Wounds became infected within hours. Malaria, dysentery, nameless fevers did what Javanese blades could not reach, and the attacks never ceased. Every time the Mongols tried to regroup, another wave of warriors surged from the vegetation. They struck with spears, with blowpipes, with short swords, and vanished before a counterattack could be organized. It was a war of ghosts, a war where the earth, the water, the air, and the jungle fought on the same side. The Brantus River, which had guided them to victory against Kadiri, now became their grave. Wijaya's warriors knew every bend, every sandbar, every stretch where the current was deadly. Soldiers who tried to cross were swept away by the waters. Barges were set ablaze from the riverbanks. The Chinese junks, designed for the open sea, ran aground in the narrow meanders. Shibi, the general who had led the campaign with the arrogance of one who represents the most powerful empire on earth, understood too late what had happened. He had been used. Every step of that alliance had been calculated by Wijaya. The Javanese prince had let the Mongols do the dirty work, defeat Jayakatwang, exhaust their forces, push deep into terrain they did not understand, and then he had sprung the trap. He was the only man in documented history to have double-crossed the Mongol horde, and he had gotten away with it. The decision to retreat was desperate but inevitable. The Yuan generals gathered their surviving troops and ordered the march to the northern coast, to the ships still anchored offshore. But even the retreat was an ordeal. Every kilometer of jungle hid more ambushes. The Javanese harassed them relentlessly, biting at their flanks, attacking the rearguard, cutting supply lines. The monsoon winds were approaching. If the ships did not sail before the currents changed, they would be stranded on a hostile island for 6 months. 6 months that none of them would survive. The race to the coast was a nightmare of heat, disease, and death. Soldiers who had crossed continents collapsed from fevers that had no name. Horses that had galloped the steppes of Mongolia crumpled in the tropical mud, unable to bear the humidity and the swarms of insects that covered their skin. The wounded were abandoned. The dead were left unburied, swallowed by vegetation that seemed to feed on the fallen. When the survivors finally reached the coast and scrambled aboard their ships, the army that had sailed from Quanzhou with the glory of empire in its sails was unrecognizable. Chinese chronicles record more than 3,000 elite soldiers killed in the ambushes. But modern research estimates that the actual losses were devastatingly higher. Up to 60% of the expeditionary force, between 12,000 and 18,000 men, perished. Some in combat. Many from disease, others drowned during the chaotic evacuations. An unknown number were captured, ships were destroyed or seized by the Javanese fleet under the command of Arya Adhikara. On the 31st of May, 1293, the remnants of the fleet weighed anchor and set course for the north. They sailed for 68 days. In August, they arrived in China. The silence on the docks of Quanzhou was more eloquent than any declaration. Where 1,000 ships loaded with warriors had departed, battered hulls returned carrying gaunt, sick, defeated men. They brought with them Jayakatwang's children as prisoners, a map of Java, population records, and valuables worth more than 500,000 silver coins. But they did not bring the only thing that mattered, the island's submission. Punishment was swift. Shibi, the commanding general, received 70 lashes and the confiscation of 1/3 of his property. Ike Mese was reprimanded and suffered the same loss of wealth. Only Gao Xing was rewarded for having protected the soldiers during the retreat. Years later, the emperor pardoned Shibi and Ike Mese and restored their properties, but the humiliation was already indelible. Kublai Khan, according to the records, planned a second invasion with 100,000 soldiers, but death prevented it. He passed away the following year, in 1294, without having avenged the insult of Java. The invasion of the island was the last military expedition of his reign, and one of his bitterest defeats. On the other side of the sea, in the heart of that jungle that had devoured an empire, Raden Wijaya was crowned king on the 12th of November, 1293. He took the royal title of Katarajasa Jayawardhana. His kingdom, born from the bitterness of a jungle fruit, was called Majapahit, and against all expectation, against all logic, it became the most powerful empire in Southeast Asia. Majapahit grew to control territories stretching from Malaysia to Western New Guinea, from Bali to the Philippines. For more than 2 centuries, its ships dominated the trade routes of the archipelago. Its temples rose as testaments of stone. Its culture flourished in a golden age that Indonesians still remember with pride. The travelers who came afterward, Ibn Battuta, Odoric of Pordenone, wrote that the Mongols attempted to invade Java several more times, but always failed. The invasion also left a technological imprint. The Javanese adopted Chinese shipbuilding techniques, creating a new hybrid vessel type known as the Zhong. It was possibly during that campaign that gunpowder first arrived in the Indonesian archipelago. From the attempt at destruction, innovation was born. But the deepest legacy of that campaign of 1293 was neither political nor technological. It was the definitive demonstration that there existed forces in this world that not even the Mongols could conquer. It was not stone walls that stopped them, as in the fortresses of Europe. It was not typhoons sent by the gods, as in Japan. It was something more elemental, more ancient, more relentless. It was the jungle, the trees that closed off the roads, the rivers that swallowed the horsemen, the heat that melted the will, the insects that carried death in their microscopic stingers, the vegetation that concealed the warriors and blinded the invaders, the very earth of Java as if it possessed consciousness, as if it knew that those men did not belong there. And it was a man, an exiled prince who lost everything and rebuilt the world from the ashes, who used his enemies to destroy his enemies, who smiled while sharpening the knife, who understood something that the Mongol generals, with all their experience of continental conquest, failed to grasp. That in the jungle, knowledge of the terrain is worth more than 1,000 horses. That patience is more lethal than brute force. That sometimes the greatest victory begins with a bow. Raden Wijaya ruled Majapahit for 16 years until his death in 1309. But his name crossed the centuries as a permanent reminder that empires, no matter how great, have limits, that islands are not steppes, that jungles are not plains, and that when a people defends its land with the cunning born of desperation, even the most fearsome horde in the world can be devoured. Today, when the wind blows through the trees of Java, when the Brantas River winds between rice fields, under the same tropical sun that burned the skin of Mongol horsemen more than 7 centuries ago, something lingers in the air. It is not merely history, it is a warning, it is an echo. It is the voice of a jungle that once closed around an invincible army and never let it leave. And somewhere, among the roots of the Maja trees, amid the bitterness of the fruit that gave an empire its name, rests the oldest truth of all wars. The largest does not always win. Sometimes the one who knows the land beneath his feet prevails. Sometimes the one who knows how to wait prevails. Sometimes the one the world had already given up for dead prevails. Java proved it, and the world never forgot.